cloud.
Hey guys, it's March 3rd, and we're here for another Austin Software Cooperative Meetup. Today's topic is going to be Working in Public by Nadia Iqbal. So today we'll have Taylor leading us in a discussion about this book. You can find the PDF and paperback versions at Amazon and Google Reads. Goodreads. We've linked to those in the meetup, and so check us out there. And we're excited to get started. So, Taylor, you want to kick us off?
Thanks, Josh. All right. The making and maintenance of open source. All right, so I'm going to switch over to, I've linked these. These are a bunch of notes. We've done mind maps and other things. This is what I was comfortable with. It's a combination of things from, I listened to Audible. I've also gone through on the Kindle, and we'll just kind of work our way through it. I'll probably switch my screen over to look at my Kindle highlights as needed to talk about some of these things. So the introduction is tying in with some of the history of open source and how it relates to, I'd say, the way it was presented was free software movement and the philosophy around that. I think those are still here and a part of it, but the book is more interested in talking about why we have platform services and the different models of open source as things have grown and the world has become more dependent on software. Even large services that are paid for, or stuff like Facebook, is all behind the scenes. You're going to have the use of open source software. So how does that fit together? How is it organized? Sustainability and health. And that's tied in a little bit on that chapter 1 with GitHub as a platform and how that drove and made it easier to move into from something that was tighter groups and potentially smaller, and to a larger set where you have sometimes a large number of end users. Structure of open source projects, so different types, and then how do you maintain them, or what are the different roles and incentives, motivations behind both the projects, how they're run, the people involved, and the relationships between all the people, and then the work required for, I'd say, the software, not just the software, the code, but to the projects themselves. And then tying in with how do you manage the cost around all of that. And they say production, but there's also all the other hidden cost. So going right in. So the first part's pointing out, again, what we moved from as platforms or services, and I'll say tools, like GitHub have made it a lot easier for people to not have to worry about some of the infrastructure needs or the cost of maintaining tooling around writing software, as well as one of the big ones is how do you deal with the community? How do you interact with the community? Not just for larger projects, but this could be small projects that someone's maybe doing it part-time or whatever, and they need to be easier to communicate. And so platforms like GitHub have made it a lot easier, but you could include stuff like what they don't point out in the book is stuff like, I would say, Heroku made it a lot easier for developers to deploy stuff. Amazon's AWS cloud, getting things up. bringing up new services, so lowering the bar with all of those tools. And some of them have to do with companies that are offering services like that. And the other side would be the tooling around it, the actual software, allowing those things to be built. So as that's happened, then the contributors, the number of contributors increases. So let's see, number of contributors and user bases. So we have stuff with how it changes on like rules of behavior in the culture. So one of the things that was noting was if you look at some of the older stuff with maybe around Linux and Emacs and some of the older projects and how those were maintained on mailing lists and user groups and the frustrations, the rules for the cultures have had to change because of, I would say the part of it's just the number of people involved, but maybe the other part has to deal with the tooling. As the tooling has gotten better, then you have the ability to interact more with both contributors and end users and maybe taking on more maintainers versus in the past, the tooling was, the tooling and services weren't there. So you as a maintainer are gonna have to take on more. Anyways, these are kind of my thoughts around some of the first part, which is more of a critique of, I think the comments. I've been doing, been involved in with open source software since the mid 90s and using Linux back in the first 1.1 release back in the mid 90s. And I've seen a lot of that, so I was wanting to comment a little bit on those things. There's an admit. But that's more of like just saying a counter side to that. There's a lot of positives with the platform side when we look at, so if we're saying what are the positives in the GitHub, I don't have the notes here. I think I could move these over, they're in my highlights. But I have some stuff about the focus on developer workflow, and GitHub is doing this. I think other tools that have been successful over the last 10 years, but for sure the last 5 years. So if you look at software that's very successful, on the JavaScript programming language side, NPM, it's a package manager. The way that they've done things has made it really easy to distribute and share small amounts of code. So this focus on developer workflow is a big deal, a positive, and those projects that don't take that into consideration, unless you have already maybe a niche market or you a tight group that doesn't care about that, is likely to not be long-term sustainable and healthy, I'd say. So that was just my note out of what they were, she was talking about with regard to the type of features that were incorporated in GitHub. And there was some comments about, and I didn't have this in here. I could probably just write it right in, but I'm gonna actually just do it this way. Y'all can see a little bit of this live. So another area was on the free the software license. Whoa, there's a lot of typos there. And this is I guess a critique on my side against what was said in the book. It was a move towards open source software license that are more friendly to commercial needs, and GitHub apparently has shown this. I didn't go look up and view it, but a move towards license that are not what's called copyleft, if you're not familiar with that. they were referred to as their copyleft license as like a virus. So a copyleft license would be GPL. So this one is focused on this source code that you have must, whatever you create, all of the derivatives, you must also ensure that you release that as open source. And it's an intentional thing. So I don't know, I have some philosophy side on that. And I think this is coming back. In some ways, you're starting to see this come back as services out there are doing iterations on software, but not releasing their changes. So the rest of the community is ending up having to come up with their own things. I've seen some stuff in the MySQL database world where you've ended up with forks that end up having, and a fork means a clone of the open source software that ends up re-implementing something that may be in a commercial derivative that they didn't release because it was under a license that wasn't free. And then you'll have the new version actually have the same features re-implemented in a way that's even better, and it moves forward. But this is even a bigger deal on services that are created where you never see the change. So this could be something like YouTube or whatever, but you're starting to see a push for that as people are, like platforms like social media and other things are being, people are starting to say, I'd say in the last couple of years especially, seeing the problem with one entity controlling the services. So from my viewpoint, I've seen it. There's actually a push towards the other direction again. And I think this is probably a back and forth. So I guess my only thoughts on it, and I'd like to try to see license use, like when this could be something interesting to go look at, but has there been increases in MIT license was one that was commercially friendly, which I'm actually personally okay with that, but it basically says, I hope that you're good and you'll share, but you may or may not do whatever you want. And I think there's probably something that we could see where it goes back and forth on that. So that was one thing that I noted there. And let's see, I'm going to just drop some of these in here. Chapter 1, let's get through. And let's see, as one can imagine, yep, more on copyleft. That's kind of what, I don't need to copy all these, I kind of talked to it. Yeah, I actually put quite a few comments on this, but I could talk to it, so I'm not going to add the highlights right now. Oh, here's one that I found interesting. So quality of contributions. So and the amount of time it takes. So because of the ease of use, then the quality's gone down. So how do you deal with this? So this will tie in with the rest of the chapters here, but how do you deal with the quality and drive-by contributions that may not have people that care, that sort of thing, and the amount of time it'll take to work through contributions to get to ones that maybe are features that everybody wants. Maybe there's even something where someone has been working hard on doing it well, but they're way behind on the queue. So coordination around that was a comment. Let me see. Oh, I'm going to just put this comment. This is kind of my thoughts. This is wording, but I think this, I just noted it. platforms as allies was one of the comments, and I think part of the viewpoint in this, and it doesn't stay that way, but there's some viewpoints, at least from my perspective in the first introduction, chapter 1, that seemed a little bit biased towards, I guess I can just say this, towards how do you extract business value and make it sustainable, but keeping it long-term sustainable. And I think that's part of the problem. There's a shift in language as the book goes on, but I had a hard time personally with some of the language at the start. Talking about platforms as allies. So I saying the platforms as tools. Now, if you think of not the platform, but the organizations engaged. So if you think of GitHub as an ally and relationships, that makes more sense. And you see that later in the book, but some of the language I think ties in with those tendencies. I have a lot more comments on that one, but I'm not going to copy it all in. Polished, doesn't designate. I'm trying to look for anything good here to pull out. Oh, here's a couple other things I found interesting. So open source doesn't designate how software is produced. So each community can decide for themselves. And that's in some ways positive. So that autonomy. And it says produced, but it can also mean like maintenance and all these other items that we'll get to. But the other part is when you're navigating, whether you're coming in as a contributor or user, whatever it is, that can make it more difficult. So how do you deal with that? And there's also, I'll just put this in here because it's kind of related. So not just the projects, but and this is part of the culture maybe, but the culture involved developers, different opinions, and stability, security, modularity. So understanding that I think is important. It's part of the culture. You tie all this back, even like if we tied it back to cooperatives. So I'd say understanding the community is important. So what do you value? What do you prioritize? And that can be based on it's partly, I will say, is based on the people engaged. And then it's partly based on who are your target end users, but it's likely whoever is contributing and maintaining or care about those things. I think that was it. I have quite a few notes over on my highlights in Kindle, but I can pause there and I'd like to get some feedback. And I know, Watson, you have your own notes, but this is a set. I could go in more.
First chapter, I really was not that interested other than a couple of stats that they had in there. There's a study that found that in more than 85% of the open source projects on GitHub, less than 5% of developers were responsible for over 95% of the code and social interactions. So statistics like that are always interesting to me. And that's kind of a theme that runs through the book, where you've got different types of contributors and maintainers. And I think we're going to get into that later. Yeah, I think the rest of my notes are in the next chapter and beyond.
All right, thanks. Any other comments or questions? know if whether you've read the book or not, if you have some thoughts around this. All right. So chapter 2, yeah, I have a lot more on this chapter as well. And I guess I can step back for a moment. Just to make sure whoever's listening now or later, what we're talking about here on the open source, the project, and specifically when it starts with GitHub, an open source project is not just the repository. That's what has the code documentation potentially, but the project implies that and many other things. It could be multiple repositories. It could be communication channels like Slack, Discord, Twitter, mailing list. Your issue tracker may or may not be on the same if you use GitHub, probably. But it's all those things, including other items like community members that do talks at conferences and stuff. So that's what we're talking about, looking at it from a larger scale. And it starts to go into that with chapter 2. I'll make it a little easier to read here. So some of my notes. Oh, culture change. I thought that was important. Some of these things, and I talked about that a little bit ago. As things are shifting, and there's rules across all of the different rules within open source across different projects. And I'd say this would be similar to what in a co-op, you're going to have different rules on how things work. You may have some base things, a lot of them share, but different ones. And reaching through private channels considered rude unless requested. I just noted that because that's, you may have in a commercial setting a different style, but if we're looking at decentralized and distributed groups, that was one thing I was thinking there, and that could tie in with how do you help make stuff sustainable as it grows, is what that's about. So if you're looking at an open source project and you have lots of private channels, or you're using channels of communication that make it difficult for the project. So some projects may say Twitter is fine, and others say, please don't ask questions on Twitter, you need to go here. If you don't try to follow the communication channels that the project is requesting, then you're making it more difficult on those who are trying to make sure the project is successful, and draining their limited time and energy, which we'll talk about more. So just kind of noting that. And I think that's true for if you were looking at a cooperative and the group that is trying to help at the level of coordination, maintenance, support, whatever the different ones that we haven't totally got to, it's a similar thing. So it's using the communication channels that are requested. And this is something I kind of mentioned. So open source is tribal. Each project has their norms. And I would say that cooperatives would be similar, unless I'm looking at cooperatives that may be, I don't know how far down I have to get to the different types. Oh, we're about to hit it. I'm going to have to go, I'll wait a moment and come back. Yeah, I mentioned this one earlier. I mentioned this one. So here we go. This is one of the big ones. So federations, clubs, toys, and stadiums. So this is the types of projects that are labeled, and it seems like this I was tying it back in my own mind when I was looking at this. How does this relate to a cooperative as part of it? We're also engaged ourselves, Volk, with doing open source software development. So it's kind of twofold for me. So federations have a large number of contributors and a large number of users. Clubs have a smaller set of, usually it's going to be a smaller set of contributors and users, but they're very dedicated to the project, even if it doesn't have a large user base, even if it's old and there's other things. They're very dedicated. Toys are indicating a project that someone or a small number of people are doing just for themselves, and maybe there's no other users other themselves. And Stadium is about projects that have a very small number of contributors or the creators and a large number of users. And one of the things that was noted was the federations, even though it's kind of the ideal where you're going to have a large number of contributors, you're going to distribute the work, and you also have a high number of users that want to use it. It's actually a much smaller number of open source projects out there. And I guess potentially even, I wonder if that's true for non-open source. You may have some thoughts on that, Watson, as far as enterprise software and everything, how that would fit in. But Kubernetes, Linux itself, the Linux project, Node.js were a few things. They didn't note Kubernetes, but I know that's one that would be thought of as that. And I don't have any club examples here, but Stadium, there's projects that are really big that have hundreds of thousands of users, or that are used by even a large number of projects that are really big. And they're only maintained by one developer. One person's doing all of the work and answering all the questions. So I think that's interesting. And I could see this with just tying it back to cooperatives. I could see a cooperative with a smaller, we may be getting a little bit ahead here because I don't see my notes. I'm going to scoot down here because I think this is one thing that we're missing talking. So on open source projects, and you're going to have some people that are going to be maintainers. These are people that they may be writing the software, they may be focused on coordinating all the requests, dealing with merging and changes, but they care about or designing, like, what is the next version long term. They care about the long term aspects of the projects, and they're dedicated to it. And just some numbers that she had in the book as about a lot of the projects, you could have a small number, like 1 to 5, that are really long-term maintainers that may be there for quite a while. And they do rotate out, but it's going to be a lot harder to find people that are dedicated. And then you have some next level of contributors, which contribute at different levels. And then the users. So when you're looking at like a scale, the number of users, it goes way out. So when one of the things noted with maintainers is, because of the fact that the user bases, if a project gets big enough, can be so huge, then a lot of what they can end up doing is coordinating and dealing with the contributions and requests from users versus a lot of the creation process. So you may only have a very small amount on creating new things that's exciting and fun, and a lot of the aspect is just tedious and hard. So I have this down here in my own little notes. So maintenance is also overlooked. It doesn't have the same motivation. So you have this intrinsic motivation for creation, and coordination, support, and all this is a lot of work. It's critical for growth. If you want to have more contributors, then you have to make that work responsive, putting in the stuff that doesn't break things. And as it becomes larger, it becomes harder and harder. So how do you do this? Maintainers or the leaders have to have this long-term commitment. And if you, sometimes this is something I was noting, I'm maybe jumping ahead here, but users can have the same long-term commitment. I'm going to go back in chapter 2 so I don't go too far out. So I'm sure, Watson, that you may have it more in order. Let's see, where was I? Right here. So federations clubs. So one of the things that's on the federation side, there's some projects that have done better than others on distributing the workload of maintenance and that maintainer leadership to the multiple people within federations. It's not always the case, but some have done better than others, and they're using different types of policies. So one of them that I noted here was this liberal contribution policy, or one person, I forgot the name, but they called it optimistic merging. So the idea that you're going to try to let anybody contribute loosely and deal with, you have tooling and people that are helping to try to merge in any changes, and then others are more strict on that. But this chapter is really big, so I guess I only have a few more, so maybe I can get through it and then get some feedback from you, Watson, or anyone else. Let's see. Yeah. So clubs have a high contributor growth, but lower user growth. So one of the things noted was users often become contributors themselves. This is specifically true for clubs. It could happen anywhere. So if you have a user that's coming in and they really care about the project, they want it to last because they're using this software, then they may end up contributing. Maybe they contribute documentation, maybe they come in and talk with other users on websites like Stack Overflow and answer questions, and maybe they end up writing code themselves. In clubs, it can move potentially pretty quickly and quickly into becoming like developers because they're so tight in the feedback loop. So it's interesting seeing that. And I was thinking of, on this side, going back to the cooperative relationship, was you could see in, say, a stadium, I could think of that like a co-op that has a large number of members that are maybe like Wheatsville co-op, so, or a food co-op. So you have some number of members who are actually worker owners, but then you have all these others that are, I don't know, would you call them consumer members or something? And it seems like to me, it's like this, somewhat like a stadium, but you have users that actually could end up contributing even in that. So it's an interesting thing that I was thinking it could be interesting, where they could move up and actually become a contributor. And I have heard from some people in cooperatives that have gone from being a member like that, like at a food co-op, to helping in certain ways, to eventually actually joining the board and being eventually like a director owner and helping with decisions. So I don't know how often that happens in the open source side, probably a lot less often when we looked at that other thing. But, and let's see. Oh, so the centralization, so federations seem to be a lot more decentralized. Seems like they didn't really talk about it, but it seems like clubs could be more decentralized because you have this trusted group and you could spread things out. And then stadiums, I'm not mentioning toys here because those are the ones where it's usually one person, one project, and they may be the user. But stadiums tend to be more centralized on the structure. And just kind of thinking about this, you could have a project that starts with the structure of stadium, even though you have a small user base, but you're running the project in that format, like a centralized structure. And I was thinking, and this is just my thoughts on it, but if you're doing that, there's parts of a stadium project where your behavior on interacting with the group, specifically with a large set, you're going to tend to want to automate things and shut down interactions as quickly as possible because you have so much coming in. So if you're looking to be a decentralized, it seems like you would have to think about how do decentralized structures work and move towards that in behavior and interactions. Otherwise, you may build your process for the group, for the open source software, or if we're talking cooperative, to have those habits and processes that tend towards a stadium, like the external users. And it becomes more complex for anyone to come in and become a contributor in a stadium style, because you internalize versus externalize and open up what is your process. But for federations or decentralized, you must do it to be able to bring them in. And the other aspect is expectations. So the expectations of users in a stadium is that they can just come in and they're not taught to or educated to know if you're coming in and asking for help, here is our process. And so you're not encouraging that, which happens in federations. So it could be hard to switch a group, an organization, or a project from one to another. And that's kind of what I was talking about here for federations. And that's it. So that's chapter 2. I don't think I could pull my notes out here. This is my overall book notes. But that's my chapter 2 without going into my highlights in the Kindle.
All right. The example of the club would be AstroPi, the astronomy software. So it has a really narrow focus, and that makes it easier to recruit contributors and maintain relevance for people who are interested in astronomy software. And it is decentralized, like you said. So that's a note there. You covered basically everything that I was writing down. Yeah, I'm on to the next chapter after this.
All right. Is there any other comments? All right. Okay, so chapter 3, back here. So this is roles, incentives, and relationships. And we've kind of gone into some of that. So you have, I don't have it specifically here, but you have the maintainers, contributors, users, if we talk about that, but within a project, like who is the different type of people that are working on it. So you have the people that are maintainers or leaders, thinking of the long term, we talked about that. And then you have the contributors, which are on, I'll say a spectrum of how they work. Are they casual? Are they making significant or active? Are they actively contributing? I could say significant contributions. This doesn't mean that they contribute every day or every week or every month. There's some contributors that may be active, considered active, and they actually only contribute, say, a few times a year, but they do significant things, maybe massive code reviews and audits or something else. I don't know, whatever they're doing. And this is also ties in with this thought of self-interested. What is anybody coming in? Self-interested, or is it like a long-term view of the project? So is it self-interested and short-term views? I need this now, and I don't really care about the project. And this is important, like relation to the model that's used also. So knowing this information about the contributor base and the model that's being used, that was something that I was noting. So if you have a toy project, you may not care what the outside contributions are. It's not a big deal. You're going to keep doing it for yourself. In a federation, knowing the type of contributions and the coordination so that you can move people up is important, so that you can have, as the project grows, you can move them up. In a stadium model, it can help with flagging, here are the type of contributions that I care about, and from these people, I'm going to be able to pull them in versus everyone else I need to have on a lower priority. So long-term contributors, one of the things that it was talking about was behavior and the motivation behind all of this. So they can come in and you can see behavior from the start, is what she was talking about. This is something where you can see in the immediate interactions when you're looking at a large group of contributors. So are they coming in and commenting on existing stuff? That could be pull requests, existing issues. I brought this up earlier. It could be stuff like Stack Overflow, where you keep saying there's someone that's commenting on anything related to a project on Stack Overflow and trying to respond and basically help. And they seem to care about engaging in the community. And this can also be minor code changes or larger ones. It's all the different stuff, but it's the interaction. How do they interact? And there's this motivation of being part of the community. And then the term of casual contributors or drive-by contributors is the other name. They have a transactional relationship. So they're looking to do something. They have an input that they're doing right now, and they're trying to get something back. So they have a comment, they open a new issue, they have a question, they want it answered, they put it on Stack Overflow, or maybe they make a code change and do a pull request. They want to see it. Could be a bug that fix. It could be even a really large change, but they want to get it, whatever they're doing, a question answered, a code change in. Once it's there, then they're done. There's no other interactions in the community, or small interactions, I'll say. And if we call this a spectrum and not just black and white or on off here, then it's going to be these casual contributors are on the far low end of trying to interact with the community. At some level, they're over that direction. And long-term contributors, whether that's people that are making code changes, documentation changes, or end users that are interacting, they're on the other side. They care about the community. They're trying to, the further along you go, you could move it into what a maintainer is, like really long-term sustainability of the whole. When you think of the project, it's a community. And this is a spectrum from casual contributor towards long-term contributor. And that one is, I think this one's pretty important to, I want to just stop there for a moment before we move on to like the other part of maintainers, but just on contribution for feedback or other thoughts around this. Watson, anybody? Thoughts on this?
No, I thought
All right.
the first part of the book was pretty, I don't know, review.
All right. So creators and curators, I guess the tie-in for a lot of this is knowing that there's different roles and stuff, and that a lot of this has to do with sustainability. Who's part of the community and who is trying to utilize whatever the community is providing. And that's seemed important to me. So that's part of this, just creators and curators. So maintainers may be curators, may not. They could be also curators of the contributions. This outsider thing just made a comment here. So what defines an outsider in open source? So this comment seemed interesting to me, and it's probably applicable to cooperatives, but this ties in with also buy-in, which would be another thing. Or I'm sorry, affected outside parties. So there's some balance between who is outside the community and their participation, and then being able to protect the people that are long-term committed versus those that could destabilize. And then there's that's more of contributions specifically, but one thing I don't have here, might be in my other notes, was the relationship with what you could think of as an outsider. It'd probably be more of actually end user. So end user request and having some type of the users of the software need to have some type of say in it. And this is something that Watson, we were talking about for different open source or project, but it seemed relevant to this on the users themselves need to have some type of say or communication and feedback if we're saying open source and how if it's affecting them. And this, I guess this last part here, at least in these notes, this is my Audible notes versus Kindle, on how do you, the allowing self-coordination. So this got into a lot of comments from Eleanor Ostrom, and the commons, which we had a book review, topics with that, but the idea of software projects being the commons and the energy it takes on maintaining is limited. In fact, I think I have some notes down here. Your model. I don't have it here. So there's a limit on commons. So commons would be stuff like a forest, a national park, and we have to protect them because they're limited. And so relating it back to open source software projects. So the maintainer's time is limited, and their energy and everything else, versus the code itself. So the software itself can be freely distributed to anybody, but the time, so you could think of that as like a public good or product that anybody could have. But the side that's limited, or we need to deal with, is on the maintainers and the community side. And this area was about the effort around organization. So if you have controlled top-down type of organization coordinating, then it takes a lot more effort. But if you can support and try to encourage self-organizing and self-coordinating, then it takes a lot of the energy and efforts away from the commons, and it also has it's intrinsic motivation for people to self-coordinate. And there were some examples in the book there. I think that's it then for chapter 3. And the rest of mine goes into, let's see, I'd have to switch over. Chapter 3, chapter 4. All right. Watson, do you have anything on this, or is this still part of the review for you?
Well, you know, I appreciate that the author went through and was reading about Eleanor Ostrom and was quoting her. So, and then trying to apply those principles to open source and then open source communities. Is it worth? Well, there's 8 principles for Eleanor Ostrom that she quoted in the book. And I think that they would be really useful when creating the rules for a loosely formed organization or community, like an open source community. Probably to start out, you could use those 8 principles as a set of rules from the beginning. It's like a grand higher level meta rules in order to not go off the rails with your community. And there's some other notes I had. There was someone named Bankler that seemed to focus on the mystery of coordination costs and why coordination costs aren't so well. He seems to say that within open source, coordination costs should be high, and he's saying, because of intrinsic motivation and the fact that within open source, the successful open source projects are modular, and they're modular and they have granular tasks. That helps with the low coordination costs. So that's kind of a predictor of something being able to be self-organized. And yeah, I found it interesting, this portion on trying to manage people in the community with sanctions, because Eleanor Ostrom, one of her rules is that you have to sanction, and it needs to be graduated sanctions. So one transgression, you get one level. The second one, you get a higher level. Robert Kraut and Paul Resnick, while they were researching online communities, they noted that people sanction misbehaviors because in the long run, it improves the welfare of the group, but trolls do not care about your group. They don't care about being a part of the group or being in the in crowd, and sanctioning them actually can give them energy. So that's one thing to keep aware of when you're dealing with open source. So watch out for the trolls. Yeah, I think that's it for this chapter.
And that was on chapter 3?
I believe so.
Yeah.
Eleanor Ostrom and all that. Might be, yeah, it's not the 4.
I thought I highlighted this. Maybe it was in the other one, but I definitely like I agree with you on these 8 principles for managing the commons. I'm going to just put it right in here because I definitely think that's important. I can put a link to this. This is on the comments, this here right here. I couldn't find the link inside of my highlights, but yeah. All right. Any questions or comments from everybody else? Did we have any chats that I missed? No. All right. I'm trying to move back down to my chapter 4 notes. There we go. All right. I'm just going to copy it over. I put this, just rewrite software to clean things up. I think I can do copy. Let's see if this works. Oh, it worked. Look at that. Oh, it didn't fully work. I need to highlight it fully. Let me try that again. Copy. There we go. And there's the attribution. So rewrite software, clean things up. Henderson also points out the regular rewriting software is inherently beneficial. It helps cut away unnecessary complexity that is accumulated over time, as well as transfer knowledge and a sense of ownership to newer team members. I wrote this down just for part of this for me was like thinking health and sustainability of projects when I'm reading through all of this, and thought that was interesting. So this was from Fergus Henderson, a software engineer at Google, and they apparently rewrite software every few years at Google. Not all software, but they're saying a lot of it's getting rewritten. This is a gradual process, not like, hey, let's go rewrite software. But it's saying it hits a point where it's and I think this is kind of related to another comment, which is not here, but there's something about the innovation dilemma and disruptive software that's talked about later, where a new company, organization, project comes in, and they have some innovation that users want when it comes out, and all of a sudden the old project goes away. So knowing this, I think this is kind of, in my mind, it was kind of related. So knowing that you need to go back and look, and there's probably something tied in with like metrics and the problems and maintenance where it's time for us to take a new approach on this. So I wrote that down. I thought that was good. And let's see, I'm going to go on to the next one. I can copy. I'm just going to keep doing it this way. So in my note, so this is actually kind of related to it. So that was it. Yeah, innovation and maintenance must be balanced. So where is the cost of that, and where should you kill it? And we've actually had questions about this as a software co-op. Like, when should you say that this is done, the costs of this are too high, we need to move on. So that was something I did. And just a few notes. Just a second. So reputation has a cost. So this is about this could be, the quote was, reputation, like software maintenance over time has a cost, but I was just writing it to say, just thinking of reputation. So this could be over the whole software project. This was related to a creator or maintainer and reputation, and I think it might have been a stadium model, but I think it could be valid at any levels, and it can go up to something that's talked about in another area. But if you look at larger and larger groups and projects, it could be layers. So you have one project like in Kubernetes that's split up in many different ways. So there's a reputation at the different layers, and then the entire project, and that takes maintenance. Besides the development of the software, besides like coordination with taking in pull requests, contributions, there's reputation. And I think that's true also with a cooperative. There's maintenance on the reputation, that there's a cost to that, and that needs to be known. And if you care about it, then you need to take it into consideration, just like any other. You could have technical debt around that. And that relates to, I don't know if I'm going to get to it here, but on that the layers side that I was saying, if you open source software, you could have multiple projects that end up being part of a much larger project, but they're running autonomously or doing their own governance to some extent. But if they're starting to rely on each other, there could be more coordination. And we've talked about this before on the cooperative side, where you could have a top level open source larger group that has lots of smaller ones with their own models, and the reputation, I think, is going to tie into that too. Let's see, my next one is about Eleanor Ostrom again, and this is about let's see, this tied back into the cost of production. Actually, I just realized, so now I'm actually in the cost of production. So before I go on, chapter 4, what comments did you have or notes on chapter 4? Because I just realized my next one's for chapter 5.
Yeah, I don't know if these are chapter 4 or chapter 5 that I have here.
All right.
What was the title of chapter 4? It was the structure, or no, was that one 3? Work.
The work required by software.
Okay. Yeah, and the name of chapter 5.
Managing the cost of production.
Yeah, I think I am in, my notes are in chapter 5.
All right. Well, let's just go on to chapter 5 then. So let's see. Oh, well, I mean, you could start with just the quote at the top from, let's go down here. Yeah. Nobody can keep an open house in a great city. Jane Jacobs. This chapter is starting to address the cost. You got a lot of hidden cost beyond if someone says it's open source, so grab the source code, it's free and you're good. And that's the build up on all of this, is this cost, and then how do you deal with it? And part of that comes with what they talk about, the free rider problem. So you can have anyone can have access to it. So how do you if everyone has access, then how do you pay for the maintenance? And one of the first thing and this is tied into actually the tragedy of commons, if you have a public park, everyone can go there, but how do you maintain it? So I'm gonna just drop that in there because that's good. We've talked about this other times, but it's a good quote. And then as you start looking at that, then it's relating back, and I think we commented on this earlier, but is open source software just public goods? And it's a combination of being a public good. The code, it can be open, but there's also this aspect that's all of the work and efforts. So that's where the Eleanor Ostrom's writings have really come in and started to be beneficial. Self-managed institutions, I'll just put that in. So I did have this. So that's where these are important, self-managed institutions. And resources, so you want to be able to do that. And Drew is coming in. I'm going to invite and let Drew come in. All right. Oh, I'll do this. So how do you deal with, this is something you could see all over in social media and stuff, but how do you deal with bad behavior? Bad behavior is the norm online. So here's a quote again. Grab mine. So dealing with stuff like the fact that you have behavior that wouldn't be tolerated in person, but it's like norm and sometimes encouraged, like just go and demand things. It's fine. You can go and demand them as an end user to these projects. And maybe because sometimes you may consider it like if you were paying for the service, but often for a lot of these, you're not paying anything. Let's see, I'm going to grab this next highlight that I thought was good. So managed open source requires separating production from consumption. So treating them two different parts. Anyone can consume, but only a limited number of people can produce. So when you're looking at that, and you're talking contributors and maintainers and end users consuming and understanding that, so there's these limitations. And it goes on to talk about, one of the examples was, this relates to participatory decision-making process is the next part on that. And Python, I can highlight this and I'll take my notes too, copy. Let's do one more. Okay. That's the comment. Let's grab mine. All right. I'll put my comment after this time. So Python maintainer Guido van Rossum, he was maintaining Python until 2018, 27 years. And he stepped down primarily from fatigue over one proposal that had so much back and forth comments and other things that it just didn't work out. And it was talking about participatory decision-making process where they had it open for decisions on these proposals to anybody on two mailing lists. They could come in and it was just massive amount of people that were commenting, and you had a lot of, we talked about on the contributors that drive by or very low potentially interest in the community, self-interest, and they're going to disappear and often didn't have any enough information to actually contribute to this proposal. And so just wading through and dealing with all of those comments that didn't help with the community side was exhausting. Now he was there for 27 years, so there's other things, but there's thoughts on how would you manage this and how are you going to manage the resources? So there's some comments that they have. I'm not going to go into that on how you could do it, but a lot of it still, I think, ties back into the stuff that Eleanor Ulstrom would have said. And that was one of the big ones. Let's see. Oh, I guess I can put these, yeah. This, they're related on this. So there's a difference in the type of content. So what is it could be content, but it could be like the actions that are taking when you're asking people to collaborate and identifying what it is. So then you can say, you may want activity or content to be public, but you may not want it to be open for participation by everybody. There could be different levels, and identifying that is important for a project so that you don't run into situations where it becomes overwhelming on an area that maybe shouldn't have been completely open like that. And that seemed relevant also for cooperatives in my mind, because if you think of different levels and you can be especially if a cooperative is trying to, the community for a cooperative might be similar to an open source where the community is larger than the members potentially, that definitely for voting right, but active members, and you have this larger set. So as you go out, you could say some decisions you only want to be the owners that are long-term committed, and they're director owners if we're thinking cooperatives in my mind. And then you may have a set that you say, well, we want people that are active part of the community to get their feedback because this is affecting them. And then you may have one where you're saying, we actually want even a broader to the public to get their feedback, and being able to selectively look at that. And that was, I won't say it's completely new to us. We talked about this in some ways, but it was just the way it was communicated, I thought was helpful in keeping it in mind. And that's about it for me until unless I go to my refer notes. So chapter 5, anything there? Otherwise, I think we're headed towards conclusion. Watson, you got anything for chapter 5?
Yeah, but you went over some of them. I guess the point is, you've got static state. I'm thinking it's chapter 5, static state, and more of a dynamic state of the open source code. In the static state, it is non-excludable and non-rivalrous, which goes back to all of our either papers or videos on talking about open source and economics. So non-excludable means it can be consumed at nearly zero marginal cost, and the value of the code can be measured. One way to measure open source code is you can measure it by its number of dependencies and substitutability. So that's kind of what classically people have been thinking about open source, but and the arguments for it. But what this book brings to bear is talking about the production of open source. It functions more like a commons, as it is non-excludable and rivalrous, where attention is the rivalrous resource, meaning that you have to, there's a limited amount of it. And we can go into the conclusion, but there's some things in the conclusion about that, but that's an important thing. And if we're going to go into the conclusion, there's some other things I had that were from the other chapters. There's just one that I wanted to throw out there, and I'll throw it out there really quick. Let's see here, that I wanted some feedback on because it's just interesting to me. So the developers of Oni, I think that's how you say it, or Oni, a text editor, decided to dual license their code on a time delay for a new version. Every commit converts to open source under an MIT license after 18 months. So this is talking about this thing, I don't know, chapter 6 or 7, but it's talking about the cost of open source. But I'd like to get some comments on that. I know we probably all thought about that in some way, but they are actually doing it and saying, okay, it's MIT license, so anybody can do whatever they want with it. But if I'm assuming that if there's security problems, that they don't hold that hostage, but everything else over 18 months, how do you compare that to say open core? What do you all think?
So it sounds like you're talking about what I just recall being a long time ago, sunset license. So it goes from a proprietary to open source after a certain time.
Based on the commit, though, it's every commit, not the whole thing is now open. It's a rolling license. So you can pay for basically the last 18 months of work and get it right now, or you can wait 18 months.
So it's a sunset license based on commit instead of time.
The time is based on commit instead of, it's all done. I guess with the sunset license, as far as I want to say O'Reilly books have a sunset license. After a while, they are all common, Creative Commons, the whole thing. But with open source, one of the points in the paper, in the book, is it talks about that there's maintenance going on. So if you were to say, I just want to make it clear, if you were to say this thing is going to become completely open source after 5 years, then even the commits you're doing after those 5 years would be open source. So as long as we're talking about the same thing, but
That's interesting. So there's delay for license scope. Sorry. So I'm just going to call that a sunset license, and you have like a commit based, and then you have like a specific time, but the specific time can be it's usually tied to releases. Like this release is there, but you could do it, I don't know. I'm just thinking like you could have that automatic commit once you hit this many commits, then the source is now open source, like it relicense.
yeah.
But you also have dual license, number one. There are dual license software.
Well, this
And
has to
then,
be a dual license as well.
well, is it dual license going on? So then what do you do
Yeah.
for dual license versus a convert? So it could be dual license, but then it converts it and it says from now on it's only this.
It's a
But
dual
if it's,
license, period. Like it's an MIT license, and then they have their other game they're playing with the delayed version. I'm assuming that if you can't go to their executable and then decompile it or reverse engineer it, they'll say no.
right. And you could always say you could have a fork of the project that happens right before that commit. And then you continue doing work on the new set and say it will be open sourced again in this many commits.
Yeah. Yeah, the thing I was thinking is like, how can you really have it without it being what you just said, a release?
Yeah.
And if they had a bunch of, they must have a different repo. So it's got to be, I don't know how it works, but I would think it would be, it's nice to be accountable per commit. That seems to
Yeah.
be, you know, a bit nicer. But if it's by release, somebody can really hold that over your head and say, we're not gonna do another release,
We'll never
or
release.
we'll do one just before that 18-month period, and then we're not gonna do another one. Like time max it out.
Yeah.
Something. So if you had something behind some type of code wall, repo source control wall, let's call it, and then you were committing, and then after 18 months, you're in violation of your own rules if you don't put it over.
This goes back to some of that first part where it's talking about the license and services, and what was said, like, would we ever get the adoption if we only did GPL? Would we have the adoption? I don't know how much that's true, since by the time GitHub came around, you already had a lot of both software. But you could look at something like, we're going to provide software that are going to be used in services and behind behind doors, if it's MIT like, how do you do something where we can eventually get that back? Like software where they have a proprietary API that's a lot nicer than the open source API on top of a service. So you can run the software yourself, but you're not going to have this nice API. But they built it, it's an extension of what the open source one was. They're just not releasing the extensions. And GPL 3 would force them to do it. GPL 2 doesn't, which is part of the issue. So GPL 2 allows you to run services and not release. The only time you have to release software, the source code is if you are selling the product versus like or distributing the software. But if you're running a service, you don't. So GPL 3 tries to deal with that. But if you had something in between MIT and GPL, maybe software that had a sunset clause, yes, you can use this for writing your service, but you need to release the updates that you've done after some period of time. That way it needs to be contributed back upstream. That could be interesting. So you have a motivation to allow the commercial entities to not to have, I guess, to be ahead of their competitors by not sharing, and then helping a motivation to continue in the community because they know it's going to have to come back in. So it's kind of both ways. Could be interesting. So it'd be a specific sunset clause. Like if you're writing software and you're distributing it, let's say you wrote let's say Adobe software, if it's distributed versus a service and you have it downloaded and it uses open source directly, then legally you're supposed to release the source. But if we say a service, which a lot of them are moving towards that, then you could do a dual license specifically targeting that. I wonder if any are out there doing it. All right.
Yeah, the conclusion, if you, I don't know if you're going to go to it or I have some things. Go ahead.
Just a couple of notes on here's some things that just kind of stuck in my head the whole time. So your model could change. So understanding the different models, I think is a good thing, whether it's you're talking open source projects and trying to identify what are you wanting and what are you in already, or what are you trying to collaborating in? Whether that's a cooperative or a open source project, I think can have properties of all of these that are listed. Recognizing that so you can move around in the expectations. And I think this was kind of tied in with what you were just talking about as far as the static, what's alive, different cost. I like this part. So this last part, I was, I guess where I'm engaged a lot on the open sources around the community aspect. And the cooperative side, I guess, would be one of my passion areas too, this community aspect. So this was mentioned several times in the book in different ways, but code is a living form of knowledge and history. So that's specific to the code, but the idea of the software, open source software, is tied into that. And they referenced Unix itself being, it could be seen as a history of the hacker culture or something like that. I don't know if you remember the exact quote, but it could be reproduced because it's so well known. Unix could be reproduced based on that knowledge of how it works, and it was living and changing and everything else to fit. But human relationships is important for the value of open source projects, and I'd say also like what is cooperatives and the commons. So and these comments about cats and toasters. So the open source projects are complex living systems, just like a cat. So they're not like a toaster where you just break it apart and it's done. And I'd say cooperatives, that'd be the similar thing there. The value in the people writing the code and maintaining. So all of the people side is important, is where the value is. So the code itself is not the value, specifically in open source. And maybe even the output from a cooperative versus the people engaged for creating it. I think we went over that. Moving towards relationship culture versus consuming code products. So this relationship culture on value. So that was just another point. Those related to those, but those were like some key points for me. So conclusion, Watson, what do you have for the conclusion?
Here's a thing that I think kind of sums it up. When people talk about the attention economy, they're usually referring to the consumer's limited attention. But a producer's limited attention is just as important to consider. So they're saying that these developers, these maintainers, their attention, since it's rivalrous, this limited amount of it, you need to figure out how to manage that. You know, who's going to pay for it, all of these things.
Sounds like a good place to stop.
Yep. All right.
Thanks, everyone. We'll see you next time.
Take it easy.